Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. Today, we're going to be looking at the way in which the impact of COVID-19 has had on African economies. And I'm really pleased to have, I think, one of the greatest thinkers we have on this question, Riaz Tayob from South Africa. Riaz is a trained lawyer and holds a BA and an LLM in law, of course. He's currently a researcher at CIATINI, the Southern and Eastern African Trade Institute in South Africa, which deals with international trade and development. Riaz was the Africa representative to the Third World Network in Geneva and served as correspondent for the South-North Development Monitor, covering the UN institutions and the World Trade Organization. Riaz currently works on services trade, including health, intellectual property, as well as industrialization. I first met Riaz many years ago when he had just come back from the Cancun meeting where the African representatives all withdrew. And I think Riaz was not a small player in that whole exercise. So a very warm welcome to you, Riaz. So nice to see you again. The last time we met, in fact, was in Dakar. But you are back in South Africa and have been fasting, and so I really appreciate your giving time. But I hope you had a good break of the fast.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you, Firoze. And as always, you are too kind. I think we have a good chemistry, so the thoughts we share are always a pleasure, and it's good to be here.
Okay, so Riaz, help us understand. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the economies of African countries?
Firoze, there's variable impacts, but as well as common impacts. So countries that have imposed a lockdown have walked into the wall of budget constraints, in that they cannot impose a lockdown without imposing a lot of difficulty on people in terms of no access to money, no access to food, staying in slums where people are cramped and social distancing is virtually impossible. So those are the lockdown countries. But even on the economic side, there are challenges, because what has happened is that commodity prices have collapsed, some by 70%, some by 30%. Exports have collapsed. So the whole trade, import and export capabilities have declined significantly. So the oil price doesn't help that much if your currency drops and your exports drop. Then we also have the impact of, the slowdown in domestic economic activity. And that basically is causing serious problems, in the sense that the OECD established that South Africa could lose up to 28% of its GDP just for the lockdown in this quarter. As we know, economies are all about flows. One person's income is another person's expense. And the impact has been disastrous. In addition, because we have poorly developed social safety nets, the cost of the lockdowns or the cost of social distancing has been met by the ordinary people the worst. And this is in a context where, no one is okay unless everybody is okay, as Singapore discovered. They looked after the citizens, but kind of didn't take care of the migrants. And then after lifting the lockdown, they had to go back into a lockdown. So what we are facing is nothing short of catastrophic. I think its impact will be greater than the global financial crisis of 2008. And, Yeah, it's African countries face very difficult choices. Do you kill the virus or do you let people starve? I know it sounds like a truism now because it's been said so much, but you know what doesn't accompany that observation is that the rich countries have been playing it as business as usual, and there's been very little relief, even though there has been relief offered. This just shows the dependence of developing countries on the developed world, and economically, this is going to be a disaster. I think the gains that we've made, however slight and unequal, are going to be wiped out very quickly.
So, 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 why are our economies so vulnerable to the situation? I mean, clearly, all economies have been affected in some way, but are there particular ways that Africa uh, makes itself vulnerable to changes in price of commodities of oil and so on?
Um, yes, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, dependency theory is well developed discourse. But for example, you have some countries that rely on one or two commodities for their exports. So you have high degrees of specialization into one or two commodities or even a basket of commodities. And that makes you an international price taker. And part of the reason for this is because of the push towards globalization, the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995, the breakdown of special relationships between countries with the fall of the Berlin Wall and, the end of the Cold War, even though it was a hot war for us. So you have specialization in one or two commodities or few commodities that expose you to the commodity market prices. You have low levels of manufacturing, and this is a direct result of globalization. That is the view that we should import goods that are cheaper than we can produce them locally. And what this has meant is that inefficient producers in our region have been wiped out because the protections they enjoyed immediately in the post-colonial period have been wiped out. So we import even things like toothpicks, gloves, masks, stuff that we could produce, but it's cheaper to import. So the globalization and the World Trade Organization and free trade area agreements have reduced tariffs, have basically reduced the ability of the state to protect local producers. And consequently, we're import dependent. And this import dependency is forces us to sell products that give us hard currency. And this would be commodities. So rich countries or countries that have better fiscal room or better distribution generally produce manufactured goods, because when you increase specialization or you increase output in manufactured goods, costs go down. Whereas in agriculture and mining, the more you produce after a certain point, costs go up. So what you're doing is you're exchanging, products that keep increasing in costs of production for products whose prices go down. So that puts you into a vicious circle that of specializing in, diminishing return goods, that is mining and agriculture. And this situation is actually complicated by the fact that because you can actually export something, there is demand for your currency. And because there is demand for your currency is set at the level of your raw material exports. And the link here is that your currency would therefore be overvalued for manufactured goods. If you look at the Asian countries and China, they somehow maintain low currency values so that they can export at a stable price and at a cheap price. Whereas relative to our productive capacity, African countries' currencies are overvalued relative to productive capacity. It's very strictly. So even if we go into manufacturing, we're uncompetitive, meaning that our producers need protection. So if you look at a country like Nigeria, it's been trying to get manufacturing off the ground for ages, but it can't because it's got oil. Its currency is too high, so it's cheaper for it to import. But it's only cheaper for it to import because globalization says don't protect your producers. It's very simple. All countries protected their producers before they became rich or before they became middle income. And African countries have short circuited that process by liberalizing. So we have a real problem in, on the production side, the real economy side. But the real problem comes in with our debt. African countries pay a lot of money on a lot of their budget on servicing debt. They pay high interest rates on their debt, and cumulatively they owe over 300 billion. But they've been owing this for ages. And so when a country gets a crisis like now, and it wants to actually spend money to save people, from hunger or to invest in the health system against the virus, by spending money or printing money, it will basically cause its currency to decline. And once its currency declines, its debt service costs, that means the dollars it has to get, with its currency and pay back, increase. So it's a rock and a hard place with a kick in the face.
But you're saying that African economies have had this huge debt for a long time. So in other words, this problem precedes the COVID crisis.
Yes, it does, but now it's going to get even worse.
So
UNCTAD is talking.
Yes, go on.
Go on.
UNCTAD, you were saying?
Yeah, so UNCTAD is talking about having debt relief for African countries, calling for a debt standstill as well as suspension of interest payments. They're actually calling for basically a bankruptcy court or an international mechanism where debt can be restructured and written off without imposing costs on the country that normally come with structural adjustment programs. What they're saying is that we need a fair balance between burden sharing between the debtors and creditors, so that debt can be written off and restructured, and also resources freed up so that countries can actually respond to the crisis. So, for example, by having enough money to pay for food so that lockdowns are effective so that the virus can be killed. So this is a very radical proposal because if you remember, it took about 10 years of concerts and protests and, rock stars coming just to get a few countries debt relief in 1996 under the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. But because of globalization and everything, those countries are now just as indebted or even more so than they were in 1996. So this is a structural problem that needs a solution. And I think the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has pushed a very good line. And I think developing countries all over should club together and support this. Because if they don't, the situation is going to be very dire because you're going to get hit by economic collapse as well as the impact of the virus.
So what's the likelihood of, and we can have these recommendations, but what's the likelihood of actually debt being written off?
There have been some minor initiatives from the IMF, like something like, $500 million being made available, as well as 14 billion by the World Bank. But these are just debt initiatives, right? So there is something being done. The G20 has called for a suspension of principal as well as interest repayments from May till the end of the year, and then a resumption. Now, this is simply not enough. I mean, in terms of scale, what UNCTAD is projecting is that developing countries will need real resources in the order of 1.5 trillion US dollars. So we're getting a pittance now, and a lot of it is not as conditional as was other loans from the IMF. But the real problem is that a lot of the debt that African countries owe now is owed, private sector to private sector. So the debt is actually, covered by other covenants besides just bonds. So you need to get the participation of, the bond holders, and a lot of the debt does get sold to vulture funds who buy up the debt and then impose a lot of conditions on countries. Impose a lot of conditions on countries, for meeting the payments, but they're basically vulture funds. So the issue is, do we have a default in a series, where countries get under stress and then, every once in a while a country is going bankrupt, or do we actually collectively come together and say, look, what is the long-term situation that we can actually get together and solve the problem? So to answer your question, basically there is very limited initiatives to provide relief to developing countries. It is business as usual, and the rich countries basically seem to be using this as an excuse to tighten the noose on developing countries.
Is there any potential, you think, of a movement to say, this is your casino. You made a bet, and you're now losing out. We're not paying. The Sankara line of saying this is not our debt. We will not. We will refuse to pay it. What do you think there is potential for that?
Um, oh, there's always potential, but that potential is a function of power rather than reason. Okay? The definitions of debt sustainability have been shown to be unsustainable, and they just keep changing the debts. As Yash Tandon says, sustainable debt in Africa is like keeping someone, alive with food, just so that it's just short of them falling dead. And that's the situation. We're kept on, just a lifeline of just enough. So the real challenge comes with developing countries standing together collectively, as well as, maybe the prospects of some relief coming through if there's, a series of crises that just keep on happening. Argentina is crashing. Iran is crashing, so is Venezuela, but these countries are resilient in their own ways. But if it starts happening on a mass scale, maybe then there will be reason to take action. But I do think that there is a strong push from countries like China, who have basically pushed the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism at UNCTAD, at the South Center, at the UN. And now the woman who drove that, Yufen Lee, is now the human rights and debt special rapporteur. So that's one to watch. But basically, countries have to come together and demand this from the rich countries. The real problem is that the US and the EU, the hard currencies, are so dominant. Right? No, the ATM for international trade is just not large enough to deal with the trades that are carried out. So, for example, 70% of international transactions are in US dollars. About 28 to 29% is in the euro and 2% in the yuan. So unless you have currency swap arrangements like Asia does or Latin America is developing, you're not going to be able to net off the amounts owed between countries easily. You have to go via the US dollar. And as we are seeing, the US is running a fabulous show. You've got a clown for a president running the show and completely distracting us from what Steve Mnuchin and all of them are doing. And basically that is tightening the noose on countries. That said, the US is providing support to other central banks because there's a real problem with dollar liquidity. So for favored partners, they are getting access to swap lines like Brazil and other countries. that were typically not getting access to dollars at the Fed window. So what we have is that developing countries are facing a reduced capacity to import, as well as a reduced inflow of hard currency that will enable them to actually buy the imports that they need.
or indeed to pay off any of the debt that they've accumulated. But it seems to me that in the in the past, during the period of structural adjustment programs, there was a tendency for people to just blame the IMF and World Bank for so-called imposing these policies. But in practice, what we have seen, I think, over the last 30 years, is that our elites have a vested interest in these neoliberal policies. They have accumulated huge amounts of wealth. The difference between the rich and the poor has escalated in enormous proportions in all of our African countries. So to what extent then can we expect our leaders, our elites, to actually back a policy that would release Africa from its debts, release it from these neoliberal policies? Uh, do they not have a vested interest in its continuity? They are not affected, I would suggest. Or are they, in fact, affected by the accumulated debt and the crisis, the economic crisis that is brewing?
Firoz, I think the difficulty that we do have is that a lot of our elites are bought and paid for. In the sense that they can load up the public sector with debt, and then they or their political parties or their cronies or themselves can benefit directly from the indebtedness. So, for example, the governing party in South Africa benefited from a World Bank loan for a coal-fired power station. So the relationship is very tight, and because of the sums involved, especially for the top elite, it's almost impossible to contest because they're making so much money. And as Perkins put it in his book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, if you don't actually take on this debt, the jackals come out for you. And they literally force that down the throat of some countries, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a demand from our elites as well, because they benefit by loading up the debt. So there is a challenge. However, I think that with the development of national capital or national interests or regional interests, it might be possible for us to, for example, in the health sector, link the interests of the elites uh, with local production of health products and high-tech health goods and R&D. All this funding in the budget does not need to necessarily go to imports, although you have vested interests in imports. So if you want to put local production, for example, you got to deal with the import vested interests, and you want to try and marry them. Look, hope springs eternal, but I think this is an incident where we can say that the ability to provide, adequate ventilators and masks and gloves and so on is a function of good governance, as much as I hate the term. And it should be part of an essential products list that all countries should produce for themselves, because otherwise they will not be able to cope with this pandemic or another pandemic, because the truth of the matter is that the influenza virus is very plastic, and we could have another pandemic or other waves of this virus mutating. So there is a chance, and this is what we have to offer our elites, and people have to demand this, that we need local production of especially health products and also food, as well as a social security system. These are just essential if we are to deal with the threats that are facing us just from the health sector, let alone from other sectors.
South Africa has one of the most well-organized trade union movement, and probably the largest one in outside of North Africa, outside Tunisia, perhaps. To what extent is there organizing happening within the trade union movement? Because presumably it is their members who are also suffering, as well as those who are unemployed and so on. How much pressure do you think will come from them to make adjustments in South Africa?
At present, there's a lot of pressure because the country was in a crisis before. The previous president was rather a kleptomaniac and put a lot of the state-owned enterprises into financial problems. And South Africa at that time, and as well as now, is pursuing austerity, meaning they're not pursuing an expansionary budget. Expansionary budget spending. They're actually restricting spending. So for COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the main union affiliated to the governing party, they have been putting pressure such as, restricting the government's ability to go to the IMF for a loan and saying that we should look for other solutions or unconditional loans. I think the debate is getting a little more sophisticated now. Of course, there should be no problem for us taking our allocations or special drawing rights. That is the money we've invested, money or tokens we've invested with the IMF, so as to help us, and these are condition free. But I think the trade union movement across Africa in general has been compromised because of the precariousness of employment. So trade unions are not able to assert and fight against austerity that has basically been imposed on Africa since the global financial crisis, whether countries are, highly indebted or not. The issue of, a labor aristocracy cannot be excluded in the sense that the leaders in charge make the necessary decisions and serve up their members. The trouble is that if they continue doing this, they're going to be wiped out. So, for example, COSATU faces an existential crisis because government here is now reneging on pay increases that were that were agreed to in the past, and is also talking about retrenchments in the public service. And that is where most of COSATU's members are. So I think the contradictions are going to rise. And I think COSATU and the unions will have to be responsive to their members because this crisis is just of enormous proportions. But as I said before, these are functions of power. We have seen many times in South Africa where the actual problem that we face hasn't been met with a rational response. So assumptions of rationality should not, we shouldn't expect those kind of responses.
Indeed. So, what way out of this crisis? You're talking about the need for investment in production of basic health materials, equipment, and so on. But where's the investment going to come from?
Rose, I think that we need global cooperation. For example, the way Venezuela exchanged oil for health workers and health skills and health products is something we can do. These are non-market transactions, and perhaps they can be pursued in different ways, even if finance is a problem. And they are, there's been enormous showing of goodwill from China to the African continent, as well as by the US to, for example, South Africa and Kenya, or its usual suspects. So there is some variable. Generosity. The central question under the time of the virus is, will we get a vaccine or a therapeutic, a medicine to treat the disease, if not, prevent its spread? Will we get it in time? Will we get enough of it? This is the central question. And from that question, we can then pursue the other issues of local production. It's absolutely necessary. African countries are going to have to wait for a vaccine if there is one. Right now, or a few months ago, the estimate was that there are vaccine production capability of 600 million doses per annum. So it'll be a good 4 or 5 years before African countries get a vaccine, if one is actually invented or, created and safely tested. So this is the key problem. Now, when we look at it from an investment point of view, what we must look at it rather as an infrastructural point of view, because when we look at it at an investment point of view, the normal application is of return of investment analysis. And when countries asked for production capabilities for medicines, for machines, and for vaccines previously, for example, Indonesia asked for it during the avian flu crisis, and they were told no because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because the amount of money you invest in, and then how much money can you make out of it, outside of the crisis, matters. But actually, it doesn't matter. There are, a few different types of technologies you need for producing vaccines, and African countries should make sure they collaborate so that they have the productive capacity in the continent distributed on a regional basis, so that we can actually make the vaccine if it comes out, or make the medicine. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait in a queue, and that means 4 or 5 years before we get anything. We face a number of impediments on that. Number one is the financial resources, but these are not very high-tech stuff. They're not easy to do, and you have to get them 100% right. You don't want faulty vaccines or faulty medicines going out. But there are countries that are willing to engage in the sharing of know-how, sharing of capital goods and machines and processes. So we should take advantage of that. The real problem, however, is that COVID-19 is looking to play out even worse than the HIV/AIDS pandemic. When the HIV pandemic was really heating up, and there were medicines for treatment for it, at one stage, I can't remember the year, but it was $13,000 for a treatment. And this is what countries were forced to pay. Countries had legal rights to copy these medicines for public health needs, not to make a profit, and they were prevented from doing so. In fact, the the International Pharmaceutical Association, had a case. It was Big Pharma versus Mandela, and South Africa withdrew its case on the promise of aid, and we got PEPFAR and all those types of help. And we haven't issued compulsory licenses, and now that aid is drying up, and we don't have the capability for producing these medicines, although it is improving. So the issue is, do we take a response that increases our dependency, or do we take a response that reduces our dependency? And I'm afraid that at the geopolitical level, what has happened is that there was supposed to be a meeting or coordination at the World Health Organization. And what happened was, instead of a member state, that means all countries coming together and voting and discussing what should be done about COVID-19 at the World Health Organization, the treacherous Europeans, and I have to say that because they've always been willing to play good cop, bad cop, and then kick us in the teeth when it comes to health. And the Europeans, and particularly the Scandinavians, together with the Gates Foundation, launched an initiative called the ACT Accelerator. So basically what they did was they pledged money for an institution that will provide vaccines and medicines and do the research on COVID-19. And they've taken 7.4 billion of the aid money into their governance structure, and WHO is a part of it, but not a lead player. So basically what you've had is the privatization of the response for coordinating research, coordinating vaccine development, coordinating technology transfer. It's like they've actually learned from civil society's response to the HIV pandemic, and they said, look, we've got to look like we're doing something. And the most important thing is that the rich countries got to control the aid money and control the process. So it's been taken out of the World Health Organization, even though there are processes now by developing countries to actually make sure that there is some centralized coordination by the World Health Organization. The US at least, is rather frank. They don't like the WHO. They think they panded to China and they've pulled up their money. At least they are straight. The Europeans came in there, they're playing the cooperative game. Meanwhile, they're taking the resources and the money and putting into philanthropic and governance mechanisms that they control. And this is completely unacceptable. What it shows is that they have not really appreciated the enormity of this crisis, and also that it's business as usual. This is just another money-making situation. It's unbelievable what has happened, and you hardly get any coverage of this. I mean, there are few outfits that report on this. Knowledge Ecology International, Third World Network, Health Gap, Public Citizen, but these are few and far between. But basically, there's been a coup d'etat on the response for COVID-19. And we need to focus on what we want from WHO and how the South can use the World Health Organization resources to, set up a shopping list and a to-do list that meets our needs instead of playing these stupid northern games. I mean, it's crazy because they play these games knowing that the coronavirus can mutate. I mean, the Spanish flu, the initial flu was not so bad. The second wave was remarkably fatal. And I mean, it's just business as usual. And I think it's not a postmodern North or postmodern West. It's a post-reason West. And, developing countries have to really come together.
Yeah. You've not mentioned the Africa Union. What's its position on this whole issue of dealing with COVID? I mean, we're talking about an alliance of African states. What's been their response?
The Africa Group, I must say, the Africa Union, I haven't focused on what they've been doing particularly, because I've been focusing on the WHO Afro office. But I do know that there has been a demand from African finance ministers for debt moratorium as well as a debt cancellation. So that is very good. It's very nice to have statements because aside from our elites being bought and paid for, they also make fabulous speeches. Some of these speeches are as fine as Sankaras, but they don't do anything. So it's all the rhetoric that's coming out, but they haven't been able to club together and make very clear demands, because it is possible for countries to be played off one another. But I do think that the UN Economic Commission for Africa is pushing good responses, is pushing good agendas at the Africa Union. We just have to see it come through. The current fight, however, is at the World Health Organization with the Africa Group, that is not necessarily an AU position. The AU is receiving a lot of information and inputs and is sifting through them and trying to influence the Africa Group at the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization meets virtually on the 17th and 18th to discuss a European resolution on responding to the crisis. And they make absolutely no mention of the provision of resources for new resources for fighting COVID-19. And I think the Africa Group is getting more strenuous on this at the World Health Assembly, and the Africa Union will have to see after the deliberations this week what comes out from as an Africa Union position. So that is expected, but the Africa Group position needs to be strengthened, basically because there needs to be more resources for fighting COVID-19 under democratic control. This basically, we're talking about democratic control over science and technology instead of, corporate interests or, business interests and countries that just want to protect their firms. The proposals, if I may go into what what are we actually looking for, right? So on debt and finance, what we're talking about is an approach to cancel the debt and restructure the debt so that there is a fair balance between the burdens on creditors and debtors. Then we want an international debt restructuring mechanism for developing countries that can go through it so that you can see that countries aren't just taking the creditors for a ride, but also not imposing burden on the people of the country so that they can actually respond. Then on the health issues, what we need is we need the World Health Organization to coordinate two things. One, open manufacturing. Open manufacturing is like open source and open, that kind of thing, where we share designs, blueprints, specifications, and, machines, technology, even finance for producing essential health products. We need the WHO to establish a list and also a panel of experts so that we can have open manufacturing for products that do exist. This production will need to be protected. So, for example, it needs to be protected from cheap imports, right? Because when we need these products, we can't get it. The US just seizes products or prevents countries from getting it. And the rich countries can pay a higher price, so we're last in the line waiting for donations. So we need open manufacturing so that countries can produce locally, but also protect those investments that are being done now so that we can meet our local needs. And this is where local elites and public health needs can meet in a virtuous cycle. It doesn't have to be produced in the private sector. It can be produced in the public sector. But this is what we actually need, and we need to protect it. And the AU here is very bad because the AU is basically in coded language calling for further liberalization across the African continent under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Instead of taking time to rethink what the future looks like or what our needs are, they just want to pursue further liberalization. And we know that doesn't really matter in a crisis because countries just block the export of goods. So, for example, South Africa blocked exports to the region, like Botswana and Namibia, of hand sanitizers, gloves, and other things. And this doesn't bode well. So the AU is pushing for liberalization, including of health products, whereas what we need now is investment to meet local needs and protection. Then the second thing that we need is for products that don't exist, either don't exist in the world or don't exist locally. So don't exist in the world is medicines or treatments for COVID-19 or vaccines. This needs an open innovation model. Where we actually need to put money into R&D and mimic some type of peer-to-peer production. Although it's not peer-to-peer, it's basically knowledge sharing, filling in knowledge gaps, and basically, creating shoulders so that we can stand on them, so that we can see far. Standing on the shoulders of giants, but we got to create the shoulders rather than anything else first. So we got to have open innovation for products that do not exist. But then we also need open innovation to copy medicines like remdesivir. I don't know if I got the pronunciation right. Yeah. That are new treatments that are showing some potential, right? And we should be able to copy them and make them locally. And the whole thing is it must be regional, because what happens if the major factory in India gets contaminated by COVID-19 and can't produce, or there's a massive surge and you need increased production of medicine so that we can help a country like Brazil or the US. So we need redundancy in our productive capacity in manufacturing and of medicines. We don't need this just-in-time or highly optimized health R&D or health production systems. And this is most important, and this is what we need to get out of the World Health Organization. So it's distributed productive capacity so that we don't wait in the queue for medicines, treatments, or vaccines, as well as distributed R&D. The most important thing about distributed R&D is that Gates and the EU and all of them think that, you can put money in one side and you get innovation the other side. Whereas Dr. Fauci, Trump's favorite epidemiologist, he says that, listen, we may not even get a vaccine because some of the vaccines for SARS-CoV-1 increase the pathogenesis of people. That means you took a vaccine against SARS-CoV-1, and it increased your likelihood of contracting SARS-CoV-1. So this is a complex problem that we have, right? So what we need is we need all hands on deck. We need maximum effort because directed innovation may not give you what you want. We may get a discovery, right, that is purely accidental. And because of the severity of the virus, we need to have as many spaces and places doing R&D. The approach of the rich countries by thinking it's business as usual, they can make money from it, shows that they really don't understand the problem, or that their elites or their governments are also captured by big pharma or by other interests.
But South Africa has an industrial capacity to produce all kinds of things. And I just wonder whether, given the emergency, is there not a case for the taking over of particular factories to produce socially needed products?
There certainly is a case, but right now we are discussing lifting the lockdown because our lockdown is a lockdown plus a famine, courtesy of austerity, restricted monetary policy. So it's a lockdown plus a famine. So there is a case to be made for it, but we're talking about lifting lockdown restrictions, right, without any serious discussion around preparedness. So the epidemiological response is very good, but the public health and the socio-economic is not very good because government is not even anticipating that it will have to bail out the private hospitals here, in addition to all the other costs, because what has happened is it's told it's very large private hospital sector that they cannot do elective surgeries, and procedures. So you've got hospitals that are currently private hospitals that are making losses. You've got public hospitals that are overstrained, and the discussion is not even there. There has been some initiatives for local production, and that has been very good. But like the Europeans and Americans, they simply don't understand the scale of the problem. It's like we're doing a little bit to show that we're doing something without really meeting the need or the demand that we anticipate in this pandemic or the next. So a case has been made for nationalizations of the hospitals, but I don't think that'll come through. What you have is a very powerful set of interests in South Africa, led by old capital in this country, the old Cecil John Rhodes capital and all those kinds of folk playing a very direct role in the decision making on this. And there have been, even basic requests for food provision or income support to people have fallen on deaf ears. Because they want to keep their credit, they want to keep the credit good, and they don't want to spend. And I think the situation will mirror across other countries. But I must say that the epidemiological response from South Africa has been very good, and I've been surprised by it myself.
So when you talk about Gates, the pharmaceuticals, you talk about these venture funds like Ventura, which Bill Gates has major shares in, then we're looking at a situation in which private capital is going to take advantage of the fragility of the African economies to make a fast buck. Do you see this now as a sort of a process of a greater colonization? Some would say recolonization, but an extension of colonization of the continent.
Yes, as far as I see what Gates has done with WHO, instead of strengthening the World Health Organization, he took it totally into private control. When you look at the response on debt relief or debt cancellation for countries, I mean, it's hardly there. Countries have to request it, and we have to shine our begging bowls. So I think it's definitely a chance for recolonization, much to the contrary to a lot of people who are saying that this changes everything. I think this changes nothing as far as what we have seen. They're carrying on as business as usual. I think the lead motive for this particular experience for African countries is that the North always has more capability for cruelty. And this is what we're seeing. This is absolutely cruel to force countries to impose lockdowns, not force countries, but, I mean, this is the reality of the situations in conditions that will promote famine. I mean, this is like a medieval response, let it rip or let it wash through, as Boris Johnson was saying. I mean, why aren't we able to protect our people? You have a Department of Education because you need schools. You have a Department of Health because you need hospitals. You have a central bank because private banks go bust and carry on with a lot of shenanigans. So you need to regulate them. If you got a pandemic, why don't we have a pandemic institution? It's almost like people must serve the economy. It's really very worrying the extent to which market-orientated thinking has taken over our lives. I mean, what happened to the virtue of the nominally self-sufficient household? I mean, we've become so used to specialization and trading and depending on so many other people that we can't even respond to a crisis. In medieval times, a castle door or, gates could be shut, visitors kept away, and you would just contain the virus there, and of course, that time they were traveling at 30 miles per day. Right now, we've got far more transport, far more connectivity, and so what we have is that our thinking has become very market orientated. I mean, and people say things like, "Well, it's not so bad. More people die from drownings or from tobacco." The trouble is that your mortality rate increases when your health system capacity is reached. And I mean, Milan reached that capacity. New York City. I mean. China reached it, and they have huge capabilities. And I mean, it's so inhumane the way we're responding to this. And the rich countries, I think, the rich countries are going to press their advantage to squeeze whatever they want out of developing countries. And I think the current lot, the regime in Washington, really just wants to assert their power, and we're going to have to be very, very careful about how we play this. We're going to have to play it collectively.
Yeah, it's very hard not to conclude that there is almost a eugenic policy being implemented with people who are no longer of concern to them dying. The irony of this is that we had an interview with the author of Big Farms Make Big Food, Rob Wallace. And he makes the point that these kind of viruses that we've seen happening, SARS, Ebola, and so on, happening over the last few years is a direct result of the deforestation associated with large-scale industrial agriculture and large-scale industrial livestock production. And it is precisely in those areas that people like Bill Gates are one of the greatest proponents of the deforestation and the industrial agriculture. For them to then now take advantage of it at the WHO and just commercialize it seems to me something nothing short of outrageous. But let me stop my rant.
I mean, no, I fully agree with you, and please. I think Rob Wallace does amazing work. It's not only the pressure we put on, taking new land, for under agricultural cultivation. Rob is also very strong on the negative selection that happens when you have industrial meat farming. You keep giving antibiotics and pathogens mutate. it's strange that we talk about reservoir species. Is it bats or pangolins, and did it come out of a wet market, or did it come out of a bio lab? When any poultry or any industrial farm, right, could be where this pathogen comes from. I mean, that's look, everyone is hypothesizing, but let's also say that even in biosafety labs, right, to speed the species jump, they use ferrets and rats and mice because they can't keep splicing. It's very difficult to keep splicing to see what combination gives you the species jump. So we're never going to know. And there's all these conspiracy theories, and everyone's playing it on WhatsApp, and this Gates is getting a digital ID and all that. And I'm so concerned that people don't know whether they're going to be first or last in the queue for a vaccine. Like, where's our and I think so. I mean, on Rob Wallace and all of them, I think some of his followers, rather than he, I think we need to be very, very realistic, right? That the powers that be are doubling down. Fossil fuel industry is getting bailed out. Dirty coal is getting bailed out. Big pharma is getting support, right? It's all the cronies that are getting looked after, and everyone else is fed to the wolves. This is not a time for change, right? That said, I'm not saying that coronavirus won't bring change, right? But the forces that be will change everything to keep things the same. I mean, the Federal Reserve is gonna buy junk bonds, right? They rated junk by ratings agencies because you're not sure you're gonna get your money back. But if the Fed is buying them, they become credit rated AAA. Right? There's all these perversions that are happening. I mean, Gates is saving the world with his vaccine by taking science and technology away from democratic control, away from those who need it, who can have an input in it. So this is an age of massive perversion. It's not even shock doctrine. I think this is like shock doctrine squared. They're really going to go for it. And I think the Fed is at least a little more reasonable than the political administrations, although the European Central Bank is just daft. I mean, they're imposing costs on countries and keeping the fiscal deficits and not letting fiscal deficit limits and not giving support to countries. I mean, it just shows that even the North is captured by market thinking and neoliberal plutocracies.
Well, Riaz, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I've learned so much, and I'm sure many people watching this will really appreciate what you've been able to help us understand. I understand that you are doing some work with Equinet Africa to produce some materials around this whole issue of the health sector and the needs of that. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yes, so Equinet, along with the Eastern, Central, Southern African health communities, is basically producing credible, reliable information that holds a perspective that African people need to take care of themselves. The basis of this is not that we're against anyone, it's just that we want health equity for all Africans. And we've produced a number of briefs. The latest brief is on how we get open manufacturing and open innovation going. And we hope people can look at that so that we can influence the negotiations in Geneva at the World Health Assembly, as well as, knock gates and get BRICS and IPSA and all these development banks to use this as an opportunity to look after ourselves.
Well, it's been great. I know I could spend the better part of the day talking further with you, but I think you are also quite late at night. You've been fasting. You have to get up early tomorrow. So I want to thank you very much, Riaz, for giving us time to be on this show. It's been really enlightening, really stimulating. Thank you.
No, thank you for the opportunity, Firoze. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Go well, and I hope to be in touch again soon. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Send the link, yeah?
I will. That was Riaz Tayob from Siatini in South Africa. Goodness, what a lot of thinking he's doing. I think I was really most interesting perspective from him. Thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. This is Firoze Manji from Daraja Press signing off for today.